old school and new school. So the idea here was, given that we knew we had a short deadline in order to implement this, was not to do everything, but to really focus on what we heard this morning, which was how to identify and demonstrate the value of open data specific to different countries in Africa, not to Africa as a whole. And so what we thought we'd do is look at the idea of creating that value system that is more an exemplar than necessarily trying to boil the whole ocean. Although we may want to think about connecting groups 1 and 3 here. So the first thing was to really look at the fact that there is already a lot of robust, authenticated, open data related to nations in Africa. And sometimes that's gathered by the nation themselves, sometimes it's gathered by an NGO or a university, but lots of times it's gathered by some other government in the world. So for example, I work for NASA, and at NASA we gather satellite data that looks at crop yield in all different countries. So we can identify from space the kind of crop that's being planted in the acreage. And so that would be a useful data set for people to have access to. So one of the ideas was to, okay, it is showing up. Okay, I think we've got that. Was to first look at aggregating that existing data that comes from many different organizations, countries, and universities. So this is just an example on data.gov of things that are related to African nations that are coming from universities, federal governments, and other places that are specific to things like climate and agriculture. The second step, so the next slide, is to make sure that local residents have a voice in being able to state their priorities and needs. So whether that's working with local governments that have already done that or NGOs, or being able to give them a platform through SMS that allows them to be able to do that to help to identify those needs and priorities. The next slide, the third step is really to look at the idea of showing the success story. So there are some very specific examples of where open data is being used in specific communities in Africa to help benefit farmers and livestock breeders. So we had 2 specific examples discussed in our group. One is helping sheep and goat breeders to understand when they should sell an animal at market and when they should retain it for breeding purposes, because the kinds of attributes or traits that that animal has are ones they want to keep in their flock. And another one was on looking at the prediction of disease outbreaks. So this specifically looks at Rift Valley fever and trying to understand what are the outbreaks, how can we predict that based on a wide variety of open data we're gathering from hospitals, universities, social media that help to pull that together. So these kinds of examples don't require a nation to already have an open data portal, but they're examples of in-country instances where open data is helping citizens. So again, trying to put together the specifics around the value that an open data portal or gathering open data in a specific nation could benefit. And the next step was the idea of how do we then take all of that and also build capacity and skills. So whether this is through virtual training or through face-to-face or train the trainer or using existing groups. I think somebody mentioned the Boy Scouts earlier that go into communities and train. And the Ghana Open Data Initiative has done a really good example of this. So we share code with Ghana from data.gov, but more importantly, Ghana took that and did a completely different thing and focused their open data on trying to build capacity with the journalist community in Ghana. And so there's some really good examples of where people are doing that in sustainable ways. And speaking of sustainability, the last step is really to create that public-private partnership that will help to make this both sustain into the future and support local needs. Again, this is not meant to be like the whole thing, like this is, you know, a nation's open data portal for all things, but to really just, between now and February, to be able to build out, here's how any nation in Africa can look at data that's already being gathered in country or from outside and how it's being used to better the lives of citizens in that country in very specific ways. And what kind of organizations are there and able to partner to help make that a success. So it was a very specific focus on the value of open data. And if I could just ask my team members to stand up. Come on. Yay, team. So, thoughts?
I love it. Put together a PowerPoint deck. technology.
Sitting here smiling like, my gosh, you're amazing.
Wow.
That Jean did it, that's her.
My team.
Very succinct, cogent, very nice.
You win. Yes.
Not particularly related, but what sort of international data does the US Open Data Platform publish?
Oh, good
apart
question.
from crop yield data?
So we have a ton of data. I actually sent Kat a bunch of the different ones related to agriculture and climate, which are two of the things that I'm kind of focused on this week. But there's a lot of agriculture data, there's poverty data, there's some information about crop viability. There's a lot, and I'm happy to, is there a place we can post information from this?
On the meetup, maybe?
Yes, of course, on the meetup.
Oh, so I'll post it out onto the meetup right now.
Yeah.
And so this is, again, was just like the first piece. But the good thing is on many platforms from many nations, you can search by geolocation. So you can actually go and like on data.gov, you can just bound the specific Sierra Leone region or Niger or Kenya and be able to say, I only want data sets that are available for this specific region. And so that's really useful to exclude everything else. And we're not meaning to be intrusive, but I mean, just NASA does a lot of satellite data. So unintentionally or whatever, we have data, from space.
So just to give the specific examples of some of these that you mentioned a few of them, but to consider things like soil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have satellites that can actually tell what kind of soil there is in the ground, which I always find fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Subterranean water,
subterranean
so for drilling.
Climate, so historical climate change is there. Then there's other things like we have historical crop price data, which is quite useful. Local data, monthly,
Everything's okay.
25 countries in Africa over 10 years.
Import-export.
Import-export. Even just like roadways, distance to markets. How many hours does it take to actually access, say, fresh food market? And then, once you start getting to ag, internet, mobile phone penetration, internet penetration, there's many uses there.
And then when you think about the fact that World Bank and UN also have other data, and some of them are represented here in the world, then you start looking at, and Data.gov actually integrates those already. You're looking at gender equality, humanitarian relief, disaster, crisis management, all kinds of stuff.
And I think one of the most interesting things that we've been able to do, so NASA and NOAA have really been the lead in these large data sets and these satellite-based data sets. And what the donor agencies are being able to get to now, because we're working on information management and IT systems, is project level data. So a lot of what, as you probably know, a lot of how donors work is they do a project and then they go bug people for 6 hours on a Sunday and do these huge household surveys and interviews and say, did this work? What do you think of it? Da, da, da. So all of that is information that can be anonymized and then shared. So we're starting to do that at the local level. So we have these reports in from farmers, how many crops did you get in? Then also just for people to say, how much nutrition do you have a week? If you had more money, what would you buy? How much is your, do you have mobile phone access? If you had more minutes, who would you call? All of this information is incredibly useful to know and just hasn't been aggregated and analyzed. So there's a lot there. One of the things that we need to do is say what we haven't been able to open, because it takes a long time to go through the process of opening this data. But what's really useful is for people to say, if you open this up, here's what I'll do with it. And then you empower the people within government or within the private sector or whoever is holding that data to move through the bureaucracy to actually get this stuff online. Yeah.